All right, the floor is yours, Dimitris.
Great, many thanks. So, for you to know, the presentation is going a little bit from high level, and then we will focus on cold rooms. And the purpose is for you to see also a little bit the journey we took on cooling as a service and why we're doing what we're doing. So, as you know, the Basel Agency for Sustainable Energy, we are a non-profit. We were founded about 21 years ago by the Swiss government, the city of Basel, and we are a specialized partner of the UN Environment Programme. And we focus always, our mission has been to develop innovative business model and financial mechanisms to drive investments into energy efficiency, renewable energy, and climate-driven solutions. And that brought us back in 2018 to launch the Cooling as a Service initiative that was initially funded by a philanthropy based in California called the Clean Cooling Collaborative, that was aiming and is aiming actually to scale up energy efficiency and clean cooling across markets and sectors. So we approached them, and together with them, we saw a strong opportunity to deploy the model of pay-per-use or pay-per-service for efficient cooling systems. And the success of this initiative that ended up, I think it was 2021, gave the rise of the Global SET Alliance, so the Servitization for Energy Transition Alliance, which today aims to continue mainstreaming the model of cooling as a service, but also opening the door to other applications beyond cooling, which is also heating, lighting, because a lot of the customers we were in conversation with, they were telling us, great for cooling, but can we have actually a holistic approach where we're having more than just cooling? And as you know, for instance, in your situation, this is applicable as well because your systems are powered by solar. So it's combining the technology of solar energy production with cold storage. So we can jump to the next slide. Great. So why do we really believe in this model among other models that we have at base? The first aspect is that we really see it's a model that aligns the people, the profit, and the planet, and it really also brings forward the incentives to implement a circular economy, which is up to today a factor which is really slowing down a lot of companies to engage with circular economy because it seems at first difficult and expensive to do circular economy. However, when you approach the topic on a servitization aspect, it's something that makes really business sense. And why does it make business sense? Because the approach really drives your business to prioritize efficiency, because it certainly makes business sense and increases your profit margin. The second aspect is that through a pay-per-use approach, as you know, you're looking long-term at your assets and you're trying to optimize return on investment of your asset throughout the different stages of operation, which includes maintenance, repairs of your system. You do things so that you don't jeopardize your performance, but also you're trying to maximize the life cycle of the asset to potentially increase the value of certain subcomponents when you scrap the asset, or you find ways to reuse the components, sell them to secondhand markets, etc. So it really is an approach that embeds the circular economy, which is design, reuse, repair and reuse and recycle, really within the core of the business model. And here below you have a quote from a partner of ours, Care, from Dave Marcanes, who is a champion in cooling as a service. So they've been implementing cooling as a service actually before the cooling as a service initiative, and they've been really instrumental in the collaboration of the initiative with us, sharing best practices, and really also sharing their knowledge on how they did this within the markets. But they deploy cooling as a service on bigger applications. And so to quote him on his sentence here, if you're an industry that does not got this yet, either be disrupted by it or be the disruptor in it by doing it. And we have a video on this that you can see afterwards in your own time. So cooling as a service, the model of servitization, as you know, is not new. It's a model that started being applied in the printing sector many years back, among other sectors. Of course, you have software as a service as well, but in hardware, one very famous example is Xerox with paper paper that you print instead of owning the printing machine. So a lot of corporates approach these systems as such today. And then it's a model as well, as you know, applied to solar, which really enabled that market to uptake drastically in the US initially with power purchase agreements, which now is becoming more and more common across regions, but it's not yet applicable in many countries. So for instance, Selina actually worked in a project called Solar for Health, which one of the countries in particular was not allowing to have yet power purchase agreements in the country. So there are still efforts to be done to enable customers to benefit from the technology as a service approach. And it's a model that also in e-mobility is becoming to be more common. However, there is still a big gap related to energy efficiency. And that's where we saw really an opportunity to apply that model. And we started with cooling. And why cooling? And we saw that there is a potential really to have a similar impact as for solar energy. And the reasons behind we focused on cooling is on the next slides. Basically, cooling, we know, and according also to the partners we speak to, it's a market which is set to rise drastically. So figures that are available open source is that by 2050, it's estimated to triple in size from 10% to 30%, and also related, of course, to its energy consumption. And what we see is that there is a big risk on that related to energy consumption. So customers in overall, they purchase systems that are between 40 to 60% less energy efficient than the systems they could purchase in their respective markets. And due to the fact that cooling is, in essence, a fluctuating demand asset, it represents a big risk, not only on the climate, but also on the grid. And so it means that suddenly you need to cope with that demand on the grid for systems that are connected on the grid, which also means that you start to be really reliant on fossil fuel powered generation, which kills a little bit the transition to renewables. So having systems that are more energy efficient drives also hand in hand the deployment of renewable energy, which is something for us which is, as a foundation, really key, which was an aspect of why we were looking to implement an interesting business model within that industry. So, of course, there is a massive opportunity with that increase in market demand. From a financing perspective, sorry, we see that the figures being exposed is that there is more than 6.9 trillion US dollars to be invested in cooling over the next 30 years, which of course is great from an investment perspective and from a demand perspective, but it needs to be done in a long-term sustainable manner. And we believe that with cooling as a service and with, when applicable, it can really help the markets shift to the better technologies out there. So we can shift to the next slide. So even though the benefits of energy efficiency are very clear on paper, what you know and what we see as well is that customers unfortunately don't engage with the best technologies on the markets. So the figures are shared earlier from customers buying systems that are 40 to 60% less energy efficient than the systems they have in their respective markets, is really something we see up to today really dragging. And this, even though, especially for cooling, we see that there is a massive advantage cost-wise in going for more energy efficient systems. Sometimes those systems are 90% more effective if going into more energy efficient systems that consume less water, less energy, less maintenance, etc., etc. However, even though this is happening, customers don't buy those systems. And the reasons behind is on the next slide. And those are reasons that you know very well and that I also feel very much connected as a private customer. So Selina, you can jump to the next slide. It's basically the higher upfront cost of those fancy technologies, fancy in brackets, because a lot of them are mature on the market. And the lack of trust in performance as buyers, and also maintenance risk and hidden costs we fear as customers when we buy systems that we don't really have, let's say, such a high database of track record of those technologies. And because of that, basically, we as customers, we're reluctant to make the further investment requirement. And of course, we do have as customers our day-to-day businesses to run, even as you know, as smallholder farmers. So we who really live on a day-by-day basis with the capital that they have in their pockets. So it means that they're keeping that money for their core business. So in the case of smallholder farmers, farming their land and also their day-to-day life costs. So the solution we saw, and it's the solution that you know very well, it's shifting from, instead of selling assets, to a pay-per-use model, whereby you as entrepreneurs and businesses keep ownership of the equipment. You're shifting from a CapEx to an OpEx operation for the customers, which is also applicable for the small, the farmer. And you really bring within the day-to-day core business operations the incentives to drive an efficient operation and an efficient consumption of your cold room throughout the entire life cycle cost of your system. So you have you don't anymore purchase an equipment and as a customer and then rely, let's say, on service lifecycle agreements, and as a business as well, rely on SLA contracts to optimize your business profits. But here is really on a day-to-day basis. You have you can take action to optimize your profit margins and your operations on the ground. There are various models that exist to recapitalize the mechanism of cooling as a service. A classic one is a sale and leaseback mechanism, which I would say for cold rooms would be the first approach to go for. And then as businesses scale and as opportunities of investment can be bundled, SPVs or special purpose vehicles can be the way to go, but which are particularly interesting for financial institutions because they can reduce their cost of deploying funds for particular applications. So what are the advantages for the customers? This is, I would say, almost trivial. It's no capital expenditure for the farmers. And let's say if you have a building owner as well, applicable, reduced operating expense. The service is off balance, which is an argument that we bring forward, not for the smallholder farmers, but for industrial applications or residential applications where it has also tax implications. Benefits. There are no performance risk. There is a full outsourcing of the cooling service and the customer can focus into their core business. And here really that's also something we know, let's say the selling argument towards smallholder farmers needs to be adapted. It's not so much about performance risk per se, even though it exists, but for a lot of those smallholder farmers, as you know, they don't even consider cold room storage. So here it's more about capital risk. So it's trying to find the right selling strategies with your smallholder farmers so that we reduce the capital risk that they see in using the cold room, and that in the short term, they can very quickly see the gains in using your cold storage, and therefore shift afterwards to trusting to deploy in paying for the service that you provide on the ground. We can jump to the next slide. For yourself, it's you jump 2 slides. Yeah, thank you. For yourself, it's having the ability to deploy the full potential of the technology. And what we love in this approach is basically with your partners. And that's something that we can also support through the community of practice of the SET Alliance, is to make the synergies with the partners that you have in the equipment per se to really drive energy efficiency and performance gains into your business. For me, as a background engineer, it's something as well I particularly appreciate because it means as an entity designing those technologies, it enables you to be much closer to market and to deploy innovation in a much faster manner without the similar lead times that you would have when you try to sell the technology, but also to collect feedback on those technologies on the ground, on their performance, and to really optimize it as regularly as you see it makes sense business-wise. So there is really a drive in demand for energy efficiency and renewable energy. And what is interesting also for investors, it's if you collect the right data, is this approach of predictable and continuous revenue streams. And as well, of course, it's bringing additional value to customers instead of selling equipment and parts. So for instance, here is also if you serve smallholder farmers and you see that there are other needs for the smallholder farmers, name it, for instance, access to light or access to charging of electricity for particular applications for the smallholder farmers, or access to mobility. These are things that throughout the journey of scaling your business, you can start to implement and to bring more value to the customers and really see that impact on the ground. So another aspect is also irrigation and water access. So for the investors, it's really an opportunity to place green funding. For impact investors, it's an opportunity really to place these funds on climate impact and social impact opportunities, and to be the front runners to finance a model of servitization, which is something new, but something which now is bringing a lot of echo into the financial sector. And it's also to invest into assets that generate recurrent revenues. And in the aspect of as a service, also for cold rooms, what is particularly interesting there with the aspect of your VCCA is to connect it with digitalization, which collects the right data to track performance of the asset, performance of the business, so credit validity of the business. But it also means that down the road, there could be a more easy transition for secondhand markets, so some of the equipments. And investors, that's an aspect that they particularly like, which means also opening up the frame to a more appealing leasing type of funding between the investor and yourself, right? So because between the investor that deploys capital to yourself with an interest rate, this is like a classic type of leasing approach, where the more data that they have, the more kind of interesting interest rate they can provide to you for deploying those assets. A very high level, some of the financial mechanisms that work in cooling as a service. This one is the more standard one, which I mentioned earlier, the sale and leaseback mechanism, where technology provider signs a leasing contract with the financial institution, one or several, signs a cooling as a service contract with one or multiple customers. And there is also the option to have a guarantee provider on insurance to cover part of the risk of the cooling as a service contract. This is very typical for very large systems like HVACs in office buildings, real estate, or industrial applications. Also possible in the case of yourselves. However, what we see is always when you include a guarantee that can increase the price of your solution. So maybe not something to be considered initially. However, what can be implemented as well, which could be interesting, is a mixture of grant money and commercial debt or impact funds from the financial entity. And that actually the grant can sometimes also be used as a guarantee, which is something that we're trying to look into as well, which is off topic from the presentation here, but the opportunity to design actually a guarantee fund based on donations, which would enable entities like yourself to leverage more capital from financial institutions. So we can go to the next slide. And here's a second example with a special purpose vehicle, which, as mentioned earlier, is a nice way once you start to have the opportunity to bundle projects together. You can do so in a SPV, and that's interesting for investors because it lowers their cost of deploying funds. So what is essential for a successful cooling as a service model? And here we collected together some of the relevant parameters, but of course, like those can be extended, and you'll see like it's a mixture between parameters that can be embedded within the cooling as a service model, the pricing model, which you will see in a bit, but also it goes beyond that. It goes really almost on a operational shift for the businesses that apply cooling as a service. So the first aspect is the type of pricing. So how do you price your service to your smallholder farmer? Do you do it per crate, per kilo? Do you do it per day, or do you offer a membership? And also, how can you deal with discounts? Because as we know, because customers are reluctant to use cold storage and they don't know if they can sell the next day, they always try to bargain discounts on the pricing of storing per night. And here there could be strategies, selling strategies to try and bypass those type of arguments with customers, such as, okay, offering discounts for referral strategies, or offering discounts if the customer becomes a champion for your company. So sharing, participating in workshops to farmer communities in expressing why it makes sense to use your services. So those type of approaches can be tailored to specific locations. Then the second aspect is, how is the room operated? So really trying to track as closely as possible how the business is being operated on the ground, meaning how the door is being opened, closed, the frequencies of these, where are the crates being positioned, which crates are where, what crop is placed where, together with which other crop. Is it optimized or not? Does it influence positively the shelf life of the crop or not? So there are many aspects that can be tracked with data, and that's also kind of the purpose of the app of your VCCA of Cultivate, is to be able to track this digitally, which is more scalable to do than to do it manually. And then as well, it's about being connected to the room and collecting these data on ideally on a real time, so that you can see really what's happening on the ground. Then the third aspect is the location of the room. So it's important to have a high capacity, and ideally we like to have multi-commodity storage, because we think it's an approach that can enable to have a higher capacity usage of the cold room and go away from seasonal storage, which is an approach to take. However, seasonal storage is challenging due to the fact that automatically the room might be not in use for a certain period of the year, which means that affects your price to your end customer, and also the return on investment, and also your dependency on grants and donations. So diversification is key. And there we also see potentially the importance to see how flexible it is to move the room if needed. So if you go for a seasonal approach, then can you move that room? Can you move it easily? Can you bring it to other crops which kind of almost overlap with that seasonal approach? That could be an approach. However, being in a position, in a location where you have multi-commodity storage, enables you to kind of try and seek for the higher capacity rate. Then what is the technology of the cold room? And what are really the cost of the equipment and the maintenance, and how frequently things need to be repaired? All of that needs to be traced and looped back into your pricing model to see if the initial assumptions you made are correct, and really long term, what's the profit margin of your business, and potentially what can be discussed with your partners to decrease your cost of operation of the system. So for instance, is an option like thermal storage an option which doesn't impact too much the performance of the cold room, and at the same time reduces the overall cost long term of the system, including the cost of maintenance of the batteries, for instance, and so on. Then another aspect which is important to mention and to look into, as you know, is the type of customers that you serve. So are those smallholder farmers? Are those associations? Can you make special deals with businesses to buy the crops? And for which scenario contracts are needed? So what we for sure like see is for smallholder farmers, contracts is not really needed. Sorry. For associations, a contract might be needed along with an MOU to kind of really connect on what's the day-to-day kind of relationship with those associations. The same for businesses buying the crop, especially I would say MOUs there to keep those businesses close, to hear their feedback and to see how potentially operations can be improved to bring them more value in buying the crops from your cold rooms. Then very important, and to mention as well the type of customer, whether you have like also day-to-day customers or seasonal customers, this will change, of course, the way you embed them into your pricing model. Then the next step is the type of investment profile. So what's the cost of capital that you are incurring? How does that affect the cost to the smallholder farmer or to the buyer? How much percentage do you need to bring in as a grant? Do you have the opportunity to have a full grant at the beginning so that you can really play around with your business and find the right metrics? So all of that needs to be considered. Transportation is an aspect we are actually looking also with your VCCA to embed within the Cold app, so the Cultivate app. However, it's something that you can already look into, like how are your buyers buying the crops? How are they moving it around? Who are they potentially collaborating with? All of those partners that your buyers typically might already have could be partners for your business as well. And then you need to, of course, ideally through the app as well, track the performance of your business. And here, this is something that especially the past couple of years have really risen in value in the financing sector. So having the opportunity to collaborate with an entity such as yourself and have access to data which shows credit validity, which outlines the risk of your business, and really have an opportunity to almost transparently look into why it makes sense to invest into your operations from a business perspective, from a social impact, from a climate impact. Data is really key. And that's something that you can embed as well into the pricing model, meaning, of course, today the Cultivate app is free, meaning the Cultivate app will also be long-term open source. However, long-term, there will be recurrent costs associated to data usage and maintenance usage of the app. And so all of those costs, as you, there is a background noise somewhere. I don't know. Orvashi, if you could mute, that would be great. Thank you. Apologies for that. Yeah, I was saying that yeah, so it's important to track this data and to start structuring it. I was on another point. I was on the cost of the app, yes, because basically you will see that also in the pricing sheet, you have the opportunity to already see how to embed this type of costs as you in the future will embed also multiple modules of the software into potential other softwares that you see or softwares that you already have, depending on your operations today. As you know, like having a software has a cost somewhere, so that needs to be embedded into ideally the buying price of the crop to the buyers, so that you don't load the smallholder farmers with those costs. Then very important for not in the pricing model, but overall for cooling as a service is the branding. So the branding that you really build for your company, who you are, what you do, why you do it, why you are out there, it's really key. And there we're also very happy to support you in building this branded material with you. So having a feedback, looking at it, seeing what worked and what worked less in other regions, so that you build your visual entity towards the different stakeholders that you're engaging with, and that really they understand what it is that you're doing on a cooling as a service approach and why it makes sense. And connected to point 8, actually, it's preparing investment reports. So the more data you have, the easier it is to build those reports and to share those figures to investors. That's a feedback we recently received from investors from a cold room operator that was seeking for investments, where the investor was very keen to invest, but they pulled the brakes because they didn't have visibility on certain data, and that basically delayed their investment decision. So hence, really important within the framework also of Cultivate. This is part of the mandate we're trying to put together. Have this data to be able to prepare the investment reports for your future investors. And the last point is network. Really, and you're already doing this because you reach out for the incubator of your VCCA, but it's really surrounding yourselves with network associations, experts out there that can connect you to relevant people, relevant grant opportunities, investor opportunities, and exposure opportunities. Like for instance, also be proactive in seeing, can you be present in a future COP event, where we saw actually last year together with Selina, we were at the COP in Egypt, and we met a new cold room operator there, which was absolutely great to see him being able to be present in that network. We can jump to the next slide. Great. So very high level case study from a company you most probably have heard of, Cold Hubs. So Cold Hubs in Nigeria has been deploying the pay-per-use or pay-per-store model for quite some years. I think today they have about a little bit more than 54 cold rooms implemented in the country. Their approach, at least one of them, which was shared in a case study, is charging smallholder farmers a fee of $50 US to store a 20-kilogram pallet of food in the cold room per day, which has shown in specific areas where they are operating to work quite well. The room operators are operated by a female operator who's also trained in operating the room adequately and also talking to smallholder farmers to using the cold room. The equipment is owned by Cold Hubs, and the installations that are planned in the near future are financed by a mixture of grants and debt investment. So the aim always on a combination of price of asset, price of service, and cost of capital is to try and aim for a quick payback on the capex and the opex of Cold Hubs. And so they really kind of focus on long-term loans with low interest rates instead of equities. How does the unit look like? In their particular case, in that case study, it was a 3 metric ton cold room being able to store about 150 units of 20 kilograms each, and they were being priced per kilogram. So one crate was a specific price, as mentioned in the earlier slide. Then the cold room is using propane refrigerant, so R290, with 24-hour around the day refrigeration, using about 658 watt of energy per hour. And it's basically designed for off-grid use, like many of the systems you are also using. As I know, all of your systems are solar powered, right? Yes, okay. Correct me if not. Great. So then they also use solar power, as mentioned, with approximately 5.5 kilowatts. The refrigerant used are, as I said, propane with zero GWP, global warming potential, which is especially interesting as well for investors because they want to move towards investing in scope 3 activities which have less and less impact on climate. And Cold Apps is together with the program of VCCA, they're a key partner, and they've been implementing remote monitoring to really also monitor breakdowns and downtime remotely to be able to act rapidly on site. And they've started now to deploy the pilot program of VCCA within the program that we have in Nigeria, where they're collecting data on frequency of storage, selling price of the crops of their customers, and really also check in, check out of the crates inside the cold rooms to have this data to present it also afterwards to future potential investors. So we can jump to the next slide.
Yes, we're already coming to an end now. And before I go over the organizational aspects, I would ask you, Dimitris, to present or quickly walk through the template of the business model so that everyone can see how this roughly looks. And as I said in the beginning, we will share with you the template after the session so you can start filling it out over the course of the next days. And then by next week, Thursday, when we have the kickoff pilot session, you should have it ready so you can start the pilot. Does the screen sharing work, Dimitris, for you, or?
Yes, I think you need the.
I will stop sharing my screen, and you can start sharing yours.
Yeah, super. Let me check. Let's try like this. Wait, I need, I think, to restart. Ah, got it. You see my screen? Great. So for you to know, this Excel that you will see here is a particular example that we applied cooling as a service on smaller systems. Actually, it was for freezers and fridges. So what we will do is, for the sake of the exercise, I run you through so that you see how certain of the parameters have been adapted in this model, so that you get a gut feeling on what you can do with the Excel that you have today to adopt it to your business operations. And from our side, we will also share an adapted Excel sheet which fits closer to your operations. However, it's important that you go through the exercise of trying to play around with the Excel because it will just raise questions on your behalf that you can ask to us, which makes sure that we are sure that the model is applied correctly for your operations and that we are looking into the right assumptions and that we test those assumptions adequately. So if we go into one of the important sheets is the inputs and result sheets. So here, from your side, for instance, in this particular example here, you had the user inputs, which was the size of the fridge. So that entity could have gone between fridges of 110 liters to 700 liters. These aspects here are edited in a tab which is listed here, which is called country data, where you have different tax rates, electricity price, currency, etc., for the country that you're operating it in. If it's not in, you can add a line tab, and then you add your country of interest. And here you see that, for instance, that system listed here, the different sizes of their systems, energy consumption, the price of the unit, etc. So here we have now the tab where you can change between the different size of the unit. And wait, I will move my camera because my face is in front of the graph. You have here the results. As you change the system size, kind of the business case of going for cooling as a service towards the end customer changes. So the three scenarios that the entity had here was what is the cost for an old system, like an old fridge or freezer powered by a generator, a new system, and the system of that supplier. And for instance, here, what was very interesting to see from the market, from a survey done with the customers, is that the customers that were using old fridges powered by generators, they were sometimes powering the generator, but very often they were not buying fuel, but they were buying ice to store into the cold room, or let's say the fridge, to manage temperature. And this ice was super expensive. So that was embedded into the business model survey, and then they could show to customers long term how much are they spending if they go for a solution that they're providing as a service, or if they continue using what they're using today. And so this is what the graph is shown here. Then you go into the model assumptions. So just to list very briefly, here is just like a conclusion of the different examples, right, of NPVs, savings for the customer. And there is kind of a conclusion that says, does CAS make sense, or is it more expensive? If this was more expensive here, it would say like, okay, do have a look at your parameters. Can you optimize something? It seems like cooling as a service is not an ideal approach, which can happen in some scenarios. Then we go into the model assumption sheet, where here you embed the starting date, where you implement the cold room. Every cell that you see in blue are cells that you can freely edit. They don't have a formula, it's an input. And all the cells that you see in black have a formula. Sometimes a basic formula, sometimes a very, like a more complex formula. So you embed the starting date of the contract, the length of the contract. So this, I would say, in your case, if you serve like smallholder farmers, and you don't have like a contract with them, you can still include the length of operation of that cold room in that particular location. If you sign a contract with an association or with an entity that would be having a different business relationship with you, then you can embed that figure there. And then here we have the second table, which is the equipment cost data, where we split it, the price of the fridge and the solar panel. So in your case, you can split the two or embed them together as you want, as more convenient for you. But also it's including also the cost of the installation for yourself, because there is a certain cost, of course, of bringing the asset on the ground. So don't pay too much attention for the wording. The wording here, cost of installation to the customer, it's written like this because, of course, at the end of the day, the price, everything that you do that has a price, you need to embed that price somewhere. So here it could be initially, when a customer buys an equipment, they have to pay for the implementation, the installation of that equipment. So that's why we keep that wording to reflect the comparison to how is it happening if the end customer buys this solution. And in all of the operations, we include a profit margin for yourself, which that can be done according to your region. So is it 25% according to best practices? Is it higher? Typically, service profit margin is higher than an equipment sales profit margin, so you just adopt it adequately. Then we have the project costs, and here you can also be creative in adding more variables as applicable to your business. So for instance, in this case here, we had the cost of the internet connection and insurance, because the systems were very small, so it could be easy also to be stolen. So we added an insurance in case of that would happen. The cost of a mobile application, for instance, and that could be cloud usage, maintenance usage of the software. And in that particular scenario here, the system was using thermal storage, but with a particular liquid that was a natural liquid, but had to be replaced every so and so years. So that had a cost, and so that was embedded into the model. Then we have the O&M costs, which is corrective maintenance, preventing maintenance cost. Those are pretty standard in industry, but in your scenario, I would say, because also a lot of the smaller farmers might not be using cold storage. Scenario 2, scenario 3 might not be applicable, but your scenario here is really for your own cost of operation, right? And that could be applicable if you sign a deal with, of course, a government or an association where you can compare those figures to let them know, look, in case you would go around and buy the assets, that's the cost you would have. And here, that's how, as a business, we know we are operating and we can optimize those costs in our price, end price to the customer. Then here you have the end of life cost and residual value of the asset. This aspect here can be particularly interesting when combined with digitalization. So especially in the long term, as you keep track of your asset performances, those can then be better positioned as having a residual value to your investors or to secondhand markets. Here you have economic data of the different stakeholders. And here I would say this is particularly applicable for, give me just a second. Yes, again, it's in the case that the customer buys the asset. So in your case, for smallholder farmers, might not be so applicable, of course, but for yourself, it's good to include those values here, which are again kind of business, I would say local business metrics that you need to adopt with data that you know from local data. Then we have the economic data, which is your annual inflation, annual energy cost inflation. Of course, you're using solar energy, but that figure here is used to kind of relate to customers that would be using generators. And you have the, so as a result, the monthly energy cost inflation. Then very important, you have the financing cost data. So what is the base of the investment loan? And what we added here is the opportunity to include different types of investors. Investors, they typically like if you as an entity bring a little bit of capital into the deal, but that capital can also be, for instance, a mixture with grant money that you say, okay, we've secured X amount of grants that we're pulling into this opportunity, and with that grant, we're trying to raise additional impact money. And there as well is what is the source of your grant money? What is their reputation, which can help you to raise more impact funds? Who, like these impact funds, will look at, okay, that entity must have done like a due diligence with you, so it builds trust for those impact funds to deploy capital for you. So you have here the example, investor one that brings 70%, the technology provider brought 30% of the capital, and that each investor has kind of an expected return on the capital they provide. So for instance, for yourself, you could even add an expected return on the capital you deploy on top of the profit margin that you have. And the same for the investor one, investor two, for instance. And then the investors are bundled together in SPV structure in this case. But even in your case, if you don't have SPV structure, that doesn't really matter. The on paper, what this reflects is just the bundling cost of those different investors playing together. Then you have the energy cost data. So for yourself, you'll be solar powered. Then you have other scenarios with generators powering the units, and what this represents from a cost perspective with the fuel, right? And that's reflected then in the case study. In the case study, meaning in the calculations, right? Then an additional thing that is worth doing in this sheet, in this model assumption sheet, is whatever estimates or assumptions you collect from the market that you think could make sense business-wise, you collect them in this sheet and you try to see how you can embed it into the pricing model. So for instance, in the case of this entity, the aspect that I mentioned earlier was embedded, which is the cost of ice per day. So what they collected with surveys that they did on the ground is that their customers were paying $2.50 per day for ice, which per month, I mean, that's a huge amount, and per year, that's a huge amount, like 780 cost of US dollars per year for the cost of ice, which that was happening indirectly to customers, and because they were paying like, you know, in incremental steps access to that ice, they were not really seeing the big picture of what that represented. And so that offered really a very strong also selling pitch for that company to the users, because they were saying, look, this is how much you're spending here. So if you go with our solution, basically that amount of extra money is inside your pocket yearly. And this type of really selling pitch on money value is really something that touched the buyers in the region. And as we know, it's also applicable for me. Anything that touch actually the capital value that it generates at the end of the day is a selling point. So for instance, you see that here they had embedded kind of that argument summary that they had from discussing with people on the ground. So for instance, they had also maintaining and servicing of malfunctioning generators with additional cost. They had the monthly cost of powering a single unit. They had as well kind of what is daily the cost of perishable foods due to maybe a misuse of temperature of the fridge, due in this case, for instance, to generators. So it was pretty interesting to kind of visualize the information that you get through surveys with the market. Any questions already based on this?
Yeah. Hey, Dimitris, this is Augustus.
Hello, Augustus.
How are you? So this model that you're showing, what I downloaded is slightly different from this.
Yes, that is correct.
Is there an update? Is there an updated version that we can get that is essentially what you're showing right now? Because this makes this is more in line of what I was hoping to get. Because the input part, for instance, here you talked about the capacity or the volume of the system. The one that I have doesn't have that, and a few other things there. So is there a way we can get this version sent to us?
Yes, absolutely. We did on purpose to share the model that was standardized for, let's say, the bigger systems out there, for you to go through the exercise of seeing, this doesn't fit, that should be different, etc. And we encourage you to do that on the next couple of days, to kind of underline things that you would see you would do differently. And then from our side, we will share this one, so that you can play around with it. But the benefit we see in you as well going through the exercise is that you might come up with also ideas that we haven't thought about, and that creates kind of it's not to influence your brain in the wrong direction.
Got it. Okay.
Great. And then we go into the calculation sheet. So here, for you to know And also you will see like this version that we will share with you is slightly different than the one you have. However, it looks complicated, but it's not really complicated. So it again has the three scenarios, scenario 1, 2, and 3. And scenario 1 is the one where they use your service as a pay-per-use approach. Very important that we see. For instance, I can already share that is here in the model assumptions. What would be also important to add is, for instance, if you want, you could detail the types of crops that you have, the price that they're being sold, to kind of try to estimate what would be the price per storage that you provide to a customer, right? Do you do it in a similar fashion, for instance, as shared with Coldubs, which is 50 cents per 20 kilogram of crate? Do you go with another direction? You would have to embed as well kind of a capacity rate that you're targeting for your cold room. So for instance, are you aiming for 50%? Are you aiming for 60%? That will change the price, right, that you offer to your customer, given that you aiming potentially for a payback period of a particular kind. So you will have to kind of do this kind of iteration analysis to see what makes sense for you. And that will then be represented inside this calculation sheet, where the calculation sheet, for instance, here, the way it was pictured was first the avoided loss of food value to the user of the fridge, which in your case, for instance, is avoided crop spoilage, which is this additional revenue to the smallholder farmer, right? Based on that additional value, there is the cooling as a service fee to that person, or let's say in your scenario, what would be easier here is not to do per farmer, because it's going to be a nightmare, this Excel, but you bundle all of the farmers together and you represent it as 1% use of your capacity usage. And so then you can really relate what's the price per day, the price of avoided loss of crops, and how that kind of estimates as a net present value to the smallholder farmer. So is the smallholder farmer better off using your cold storage, or are they actually losing money? And this is kind of the purpose of this exercise here. And in a similar manner, scenario 2 compares what's their net present value if they use another type of system, if they use a system that uses a generator. And so you can see here how this value is changing. And there is also a line item with no cold rooms at all. So actually that's also something in addition to the Excel that you downloaded, Augustus, which we will share with you. So basically like this, you can really express and input values that you collect from service in the market directly into the Excel sheet. And here, we don't have to run in detail now through that, but that's something that you could do also in your spare time, and then raise any questions that you have. I think that would be more beneficial, but basically it's the structure of the SPV, so to say, which, as I said, even though today you don't have an SPV, that's okay. It just simulates where the money comes into a pot of money and where it's being circulated back into yourself, so the provider cash flow, investor 1, investor 2. So for instance, if you have a grant money, like investor 2 doesn't get the money back, so can go into 000, and then like a financier or an impact fund can have a particular interest in having a specific return, and then here this is how figures from further up in the table are being brought into this one. There is kind of a project expected level of return that is being shown. So you can see if we run through the line items very briefly, component covering cooling tech purchase. So that's the investment into the asset. So or let's say the debt or whatever type of funding that they provide to you. The component covering the cooling as a service to the provider. So that's basically the percentage that they collect from the fee that you provide on the market, as just kind of covering the interest cost of deploying the capital for you. So it's a very kind of classic, I would say, accounting split of this approach, with kind of yielding at the end the present value of the project. Now, to jump onto the next sheet, here the example was that that particular business was storing meat or fish. It was not agriculture, but that sheet can be also used to kind of estimate what's the net present value for the farmer. And so that's kind of yielding some figures that are in the previous sheet, in the calculation sheet, and just making a summary so that you can see in the scenario of using your service, are the smallholder farmer better off? Are they making more money? And here it was like, yes. So that was also kind of the argument of reaching out to them and saying, look, if you use our service, this is what you're expected to have as money at the end of the day, which is more than what you have today. And also, like this, try to build strategies with those users to convince them to use the service. And in this case here, there was also, we simulated termination fee, which wouldn't be the case if you have a daily check-in, check-out of users, but it could be the case in case you have like a contract with an association or a larger group that connects you to multiple smaller buyers, where there you could kind of contractually, again, if you build a contract, which we, by the way, we have a simplified template of contract that you could use, which is not the very long contract for large HVAC systems, but it's a smaller contract of about, I think, 5 to 6 pages. You can embed this type of argumentation and terms and conditions inside your contract. And then I think here, this is just, you can neglect that sheet. That was more for larger systems, where we're doing a comparison of electricity price inflation. You could actually use it for fuel price inflation, but especially in the scenario where your customers today don't use cold storage, then this is a bit like they wouldn't feel in touch with that argument. There you go. That runs you a little bit through the Excel. I propose the following from our side. We will share with you this version adopted slightly to your operations, because this is really for fridges and freezers, which is good, but it's not directly related to what you will be doing. From your side, do spend the exercise already to go through the Excel that you have and try to change some parameters to see how it affects certain things. And then we will share this Excel with you so that you can embed certain of the changes you already made in the other Excel there. And then what I suggest is that you collect any questions that you have. You can share them on an email or per Slack, and then we can do a follow-up session of about half an hour. Either we group everybody in that session, or we do it individually, depending on the availability. And then we tackle those points so that we really do it iterative process with you. Yeah, we tailor the model to what works in your area.